Mr. Tillerson's press conference, all of us, I'm sure, have got the major idea in South Korea. He's talking about the end of strategic patience policy. But now, what is the policy of the U.S.?
Well, he wasn't clear about that. As you say, he's signaling a change in attitude, and he is saying very clearly that all options, presumably including military options, are on the table. But there is no evidence that the United States has made a clear decision between these options, all of which are dangerous in various ways. He is on a listening tour. He wants to discuss new options in Japan, in South Korea, and then beginning tomorrow in Beijing. And what he's saying is that the clock is ticking because North Korea is getting closer to being able to put a nuclear weapon on an intercontinental ballistic missile. Patience will not do it. But it's not clear that they have a real answer for this yet.
At this point, Mr. Teng, in Beijing, China has made its proposal, double suspension, so-called the suspense of nuclear weapons program in DPRK. At the same time, suspension of military exercise between the United States and South Korea. According to Xiao Qian, who is the director of the Asia Department from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he said there's no sequence between these two. It has to go together. So, but it seems that U.S. brushed it off.
Yeah. I think this is a very crucial moment for all the parties concerned in this region. Another round of tension has been there. So I think if the United States, if North Korea continue their movement in the same direction, there should be a clash or even war between the two sides. So this is a dangerous game, not only for the United States, not only for North Korea, but also for the regional countries, ROK and China, of course, would suffer a lot if there were a war in this region. So I think this suspension just gave some, easy environment and just to sit down. And I think the remark is so easy. So we should sit down and talk about it. No war at this moment.
Of course, the question about whether this is pragmatic to sit down at this point when it seems tensions are getting ever higher than before. Is that possible? Is a big question mark. Mr. Professor Lee, therefore, I want to go to you. What do you think about this possibility?
There are several constants in this complex story. For 5 decades or so, North Korea has been bent on developing its nuclear weapons program and has made great strides over the past 20 years or so. For the past 4 decades, South Korea and the United States have been holding these combined large-scale military exercises, and North Korea has always complained. For several decades, China has counseled patience, stability, peace, no war. And for many decades, South Korea has also fluctuated between engaging North Korea very generously and taking a hardline stance against North Korea. The reality, however, is that the era of half measures and political expedience and procrastination is over, and in its place we are entering a period of consequences. North Korea's nuclear and missile threat is no joke. It's imminent, it's real. So something different, a different approach must be taken.
It is no joke. In fact, we have also heard from Mr. Tillerson, the Secretary of State, his quotes from different stops here in Northeast Asia. Mr. Tillerson's trip expected to be a familiarization on the options that the United States might consider in responding to the nuclear threat, some say, from the DPRK. In Japan, he has conceded that 20 years of U.S. attempts of denuclearize the DPRK have failed and called for a new approach. In South Korea, as we mentioned earlier, sounded even more confident and forceful, saying the policy of strategic patience has ended and all options are on the table. The second part of the statement is extremely interesting. All options, Mr. Daly, that includes, according to Mr. Tillerson, security, political, economic, and he didn't rule out military. However, he didn't go specific at all about any of these options.
Right. That's right, but it certainly includes a military option. I would take issue, however, with the way that China, Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Professor Chen have framed the issue as being primarily between North Korea and the United States, as though those are the main two belligerents and as though they come at this sort of on an equal footing. China wants to position itself to step back as though it's a referee and a potential arbiter of this, but China has been involved right along. Secretary Tillerson did not say that this is a 20-year failure of American policy. He said it's a failure overall. yes, the failure belongs to the United States, the ROK, but also to China. China has also failed, and it has been a great enabler of North Korea. And I think that this is the attitude that Secretary of State Tillerson will come to Beijing with. It is not the case that he is going to the referee as one of the belligerents. Beijing has always been a participant, and Beijing also has raised the risk factors in the region. I think that that's going to be the grounds of the conversation in Beijing.
Just to be
He's
fair,
not going to an arbiter.
All right, just to be fair, we want to give Mr. Teng from Beijing an option of answer here. Mr. Teng, the foreign minister said dual suspension. The Chinese premier, during his annual press conference, he's talked about nobody wants chaos at his doorstep. Of course, that includes China when it comes to DPRK. How would you respond to what Mr. Daly just said?
Yeah, I think this is not a failure of China. Actually, this is a failure for all the parties concerned. In the past 20 years, the DPRK nuclear issue has been very sensitive, very crucial issue in this region, and it has already gone beyond the limitation of a technical issue. This is actually geopolitical competition between China and the United States, between the two Koreans. So we should sit down and find the real solution to the dispute. Actually, because this time the nuclear capability and the missile capability, both have become the real and the direct threat for all the countries concerned.
But Mr. Teng, I want you to be addressing the question directly, even though Mr. Daly is nodding his head, but I still want your answer. Mr. Daly earlier seemed to suggest that don't talk about the United States and the DPRK as the two parties directly involved. China also is playing a role. He was suggesting China don't not try to be the referee, but also a participant. But it seems that China has outlined this very clear. This is an issue between these two countries, DPRK, United States. China having a player role, it is only for trying to go between, trying to seek a solution. Mr. Teng.
Yeah, this is actually a miscalculation by the outside world that China has a key role in the dispute in nuclear issue in the Korean Peninsula. And if we look at the evolution of the development in DPRK, we can find, especially after the normalization of relations between China and ROK, there was a fundamental change of attitude by DPRK toward China, and this is actually a security dilemma for China. And how can China play a very important role in maintaining the peace and stability in the peninsula? And this is not for the interest of China, but also for all the parties concerned. And I'm sure at this moment, actually in recent days, we have been repeatedly asked by scholars and officials from ROK that is the United States is going to solve the dispute as a nuclear dispute in DPRK. This is a question mark, actually.
It is a question mark, Professor Lee. Therefore, you have to come in and join us for this discussion. What would be the role of South Korea? I mean, at this point, it seems that South Korea is playing a supporting role to the overall strategic plan the U.S. has in mind, whether it's for the denuclearization or not in Northeast Asia with that. So what role is South Korea going to play? Is that going to be really constructive for denuclearization, Mr. Lee?
South Korea has shifted in a real big pendular swing from one administration to the next when it comes to North Korea policy. So it remains to be seen what the next course of action will be. But I think in Washington, at least, there is an emerging consensus that sanctions against North Korea have yet to be fully applied or fully enforced, and that there is greater leverage to be gained from pressing North Korea on financial sanctions, going after North Korean entities, and blocking North Korea's partners as well from the US dollar system. That is a tactic that most people think had a positive effect on getting Iran back to the negotiating table. And it takes a while. It takes at least 3 years or so for those sanctions to take effect. I think that's the direction that the Trump administration is moving in. And it remains to be seen whether the ROK will go along with that, because if that is the consensus built by the US and its allies, the EU and the UN, and South Korea goes against it and continues to subsidize the target, Pyongyang, while others sanction it, then we have a policy problem.
Right. Mr. Daly, please shine some light for us. Is it useful to kick the ball to the other's court? You seem to,
well,
in a way,
it's in all of our courts.
Yes, go ahead.
I think it's in everybody's court. It's not simply this is an American problem or a Chinese problem or an ROK problem. All countries have failed. All countries have very strong interests in trying to solve the problem. And the problem is the nuclear DPRK regime. That is the source of this problem. The Chinese government, the Chinese people have most of the same worries about the Kim Jong-un regime as people have in South Korea and as people have here in the United States. The 3 years to help sanctions work, we don't have 3 years. All indications are that North Korea will be able to put a nuclear weapon on an intercontinental ballistic missile that can reach the United States
the clock,
within that time.
The clock is ticking, but the question is, where is the solution? Okay, China has a solution, saying let's just do dual suspension. Let's just try to sit down and talk. Okay, you have a deficit of trust. That's very clear between North Korea and the United States. But what about making some efforts at least to talk to one another while all the other things can be probably having a solution? Mr. Daly, if we just brush everything off, are we going to have any plan? Are we going to have any hope?
No, that's right. No, I would agree with Professor Chung that actually dialogue does need to be a part of the solution, and the sooner the better. I would disagree with the administration's simply taking dialogue off the table. That needs to be a piece. So do enhanced sanctions, which are not going to be sufficient, but we need to keep the pressure on. But the dual freeze, one of the things that makes me suspicious about that is this is a situation in which China, which has been a major player all along, gets exactly what it wants from every side without giving up anything. They get a freeze on the nukes, and they get on their doorstep South Korea and America discontinuing their military exercises. This sounds a little bit too convenient for China. I would also agree with Professor Chung, who said that the real framework here is balance of power between the United States and China in the Western Pacific overall. I think one of the things that Secretary Tillerson is saying is that we now know that Beijing cares more about the THAAD deployment and about South Korea's defensive deployments than it does about a nuclear North Korea.
Okay, is it true?
If deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems, let me finish the thought. If the anti-ballistic missile systems is what China cares about most, that's where American leverage lies. And so one of the things that America will consider is increased deployments in order to increase the costs of being passive for China. I think that together with sanctions, and yes, together with dialogue, I agree, will be part of the approach going forward.
All right. Mr. Daly finished his thought. And now, Mr. Teng, please begin your thought. What about that? Is China caring more about that than, let's just say, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? I want to have a follow-up, but I'll have you answer first, and then I'll have a follow-up.
I actually thought it's not a military program only. It's a political and a technical program in this region. You know, after the deployment of the system, actually there was a combination of the military forces among the three countries, Japan, ROK, and of course the United States. And this is actually a strategic program which will hurt the stability among the major powers, especially among the nuclear weapon state, among China, Russia, and the United States. So we have three choices on the table in dealing with the DPRK nuclear issue.
What are they?
Yeah, negotiation, number one, sanction, number two, and war. Which is the best? Everyone knows negotiation should be the best choice for any country. I'm sure even the United States are okay. They all, against any possibility to go to the war.
Okay, sanctions. Talk about sanctions. The follow-up is China really implementing the sanctions? Accusations coming, Secretary Tillerson suggesting China has not yet, and he's saying, quote, that is inappropriate. How would you respond to that?
No, I don't think Mr. Tillerson's remarks in ROK is rational. So this is actually a very cunning question raised by the Secretary. If you look at the evolution of the sanctions from 2006, the first sanction against DPRK related to the missile development, we can see all the complementation by the Chinese government all in the position. So I mean, the Chinese government, very serious, in the complementation of these, resolutions. So this is actually excuse from outside of the China, just took unreasonable responsibility in this regard.
All right, we don't want to repeat the accusations as if the accusations are all true. But let me go to you, Professor Lee. You're not necessarily a not involved party, but I still want to ask you this question. It seems that all parties, some suspect, try to infiltrate their own strategic goals in the name of trying to seek a solution to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Under such understanding, how should all parties work on this issue? It seems that none of the parties really trust one another.
Well, perhaps one useful question to be posed by all is, what are we talking about?
Okay,
we are talking
great
about
question.
North Korea, which is one of two Korean states, in a relatively small geographical arena called the Korean Peninsula, competing with that other Korean state, one that is more prosperous and free and democratic. So in this pan-Korean contest for legitimacy, North Korea lags behind. Without that military factor, without nuclear weapons, there are some existential questions that the Kim regime faces. So when you talk about the 9 nuclear states of the world and the feasibility of denuclearization through negotiations, we tend to think that North Korea is doable, feasible, because they are so poor and backward and mockable even. But for the very same reasons, I've maintained, because North Korea has nothing but that, it is exceedingly difficult to get North Korea to give away its nuclear weapons even for the right price.
It's a very interesting question. What are we talking about? Everybody has their different answers. But before we go, what are we talking about has a lot to do with the upcoming visit, possibly reported by the media, of Chinese President Xi Jinping to the United States to meet with President Trump. Of course, Secretary of State Mr. Tillerson coming to Northeast Asia, particularly to China, in preparation for that. So, how big this issue will be, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, in setting up the very basic level of confidence and trust between the two administrations, China here and also Washington. Mr. Teng.
First, I should say we should have a new consensus on the reality in this region. And the nuclear capability and the missile capability both have become the real and direct to all the countries. This is the real threat. And if such a threat directly targeted at the United States, I'm sure the United States will change its policy not to manipulate the situation there for their sake. We should have a new consensus to cooperate, and the trust between China and the United States should be intensified in the coming years.
Mr. Daly, all options are on the table. This has always been the quote coming from this administration, using everything as a bargaining chip, but there is a danger in that.
Sure, we don't even know if it's credible to threaten, war. Professor Chung keeps raising the possibility of war, or even a United States that we call a kinetic option, moving against North Korea's missiles and against its nuclear capability, which is probably not a realistic option right now because of the safety of the people of South Korea, because of the threat of spreading radioactive materials. So I think that the issue is not so much war, but an increase in the deployments of America and its allies in the name of self-defense, but also calculated to make China rethink its position and to consider whether there is more pressure to be brought to bear. I think that this will be one of two major issues when Xi Jinping and Donald Trump meet in Mar-a-Lago. One will be North Korea. The second will be trade relations between the two countries. Both are very thorny. And the challenge, I think, as Professor Chung and as you have said, is to try to increase trust among these difficult issues if possible. That's going to be a very tall order.
Right. It really depends on what would account as trust.
Yeah.
Mr. Lee, before we go, very briefly from you as well, Professor Lee.
This is a 30-year crisis in the making. Events will shape policy. That is, a crisis situation will enact real policy. For example, if there is a shooting war within North Korea between different military cliques, floods of refugees pouring into China, China will come to recalculate its strategic interest in North Korea. If, for example, North Korea is about to combine a nuclear warhead with a ballistic long-range missile and hit LA with it, the US will recalculate its considerations. South Korea also. We have not had war in the Korean Peninsula in over 60 years, since 1953. So deterrence and de facto peace have been maintained. I think the prospects for now are that peace will continue to be maintained, but a new crisis situation is a stumbling block that the world will have to face up to in the coming months or years.